Hi everyone. Could I just check whether I can be seen and heard?
Yeah, I can hear and see you.
Excellent.
Oh, sorry, did we do panel introductions or?
Yes, we did.
I think we already did.
We already did, yes.
Oh, okay. I must have
Right.
disconnected for a while. Yeah, my bad. Go ahead, PM.
Capitalism is dead. Left-wing parties must figure out what they can build in its wake, rather than continuing to nestle themselves within the remains of its corpse. In my speech, I will explain to you why on our side of the house we get far more voters and far more political successes. But before I get into that, just a couple of points on what this looks like. On the opposition bench, in the status quo, left-wing parties have two options. Either they split resources between different political candidates. For example, in 2016, when Bernie Sanders primaried against Joe Biden, or they tend to back moderate candidates. This looks like in the current 2024 elections, when Biden is running unopposed and Bernie doesn't run because the party says so, or in the British Labour Party, where Jeremy Corbyn was removed in favour of Keir Starmer as his replacement. On our side of the house, we will bring back firebrands. This looks like Jeremy Corbyn. This looks like Bernie Sanders. This looks like Yanis Varoufakis in the Greek party. All of these are probably good options. We think there are two features of these individuals that differentiate themselves from other other individuals. Firstly, they have a more radical policy platform. So rather than arguing for marginal adjustments in consumer spending or like taxation, for example, we will just tax the rich at extremely high rates. We have universal basic income. We are perfectly comfortable supporting things like universal free tuition. All of these are legitimate options. Number two, they have more personality, right? Like the thing about Joe Biden is that he's a bland old man. Like at the end of the day, the man represents the party and it aims to get you to support the party. But a firebrand candidate tends to try and establish a personal connection with you, a person. They sell their personality, they sell their background as a working class individual and attempts to appeal to more working class individuals because that's what left-wing party means. All of these are legitimate options that we can have on our side and explain the relative benefits of both. First argument then on how we get more left-wing voters. I think that capitalism is failing for four reasons. The first is that the large numbers of jobs that are currently moving towards the third world or being automated away means that the structural features of capitalism, which requires individuals to have an income in order to live, is collapsing as a result. Secondly, because of the collapse of the labor movement in the 1970s, inflation has continuously risen while incomes have not remained commensurate as well. Empirically, we see this by how much more expensive it is to buy a house now. In the 1980s, a single breadwinner father will be able to provide a house and car for his children. In the status quo with two parents, people can't do it at all. Rent is getting higher and higher, and individuals just don't get the income to replace this because capitalism is collapsing, the point at which it doesn't have a strong union movement anymore. Thirdly, because of forever wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, continuously funneling resources away from the first world and the working class towards killing vulnerable minorities in the third world, including in Palestine right now. Fourthly, climate change, destroying agricultural yields, making sure that it is impossible for us to continue using the capitalist structure we currently use, which demands continuous consumption of finite resources on a finite planet. All of this therefore means that capitalism is collapsing. And whether people know the intellectual causes or not, they're feeling it. They're feeling their lives get shittier. They're being told that you will have great lives. They're looking at their parents and going, fuck, my parents are living better lives than I ever did. All of these are breeding dissatisfaction that every single individual below the age of 40 feels on a day-to-day basis. Individuals feel their lives getting harder, their budget's getting smaller, they're unemployed at higher rates, they lose their jobs. All of these are necessarily harms that they feel on a day-to-day. Why then has this hurt the left? The right wing has explained why. It has given them multiple scapegoats, liberal elites controlling their lives, which actually is true. The point at which the political elite on the left as well has failed to protect them. This looks like immigrants who are the ones coming in and clamoring for their jobs. The left is continuously losing ground. Moderate individuals are moving to the right because they explain the dissatisfaction they feel at the collapse of capitalism. How does left-wing populism obliterate these problems? I will give you four mechanisms. The first is we give them someone to blame. On our side of the house, individuals begin speaking their language. We begin explaining that they genuinely are individuals, billionaires in fact, who are the ones to blame for this. And that's why Joe Biden on a very pure popularity, was actually significantly less popular than Bernie Sanders. That's why individuals en masse are able to explain the problems of capitalism as being attributable to capitalism. We explain to millions of people why this is the case. We give them evidence and the truth of why capitalism is collapsing, because billionaires are killing our planet, because people are sending our money overseas for defense contractors. All of these are causes and individuals who buy into the point at which the left actually begins speaking their language. The second thing is we forward politically popular solutions. Universal free tuition is incredibly attractive. Universal basic income is incredibly attractive. Higher corporate tax rates versus the unpopular elites are extremely attractive. Climate policy is overwhelmingly attractive in order to get a green transition. All of these are necessarily things that the left can fight for, the point at which it takes a firebrand politician who actually would have the guts essentially to defend all of these things. The third structural reason is populism and personality politics itself is often extremely popular. Individuals don't just vote for politicians because individuals don't understand the intricacies of politics. Whether or not you adjust a marginal tax rate up or down by 5% is often lost on voters. You know what isn't? A personal connection. The idea that they have the same background as you, they are working class like you are, they are dissatisfied as well. They think life sucks because you think life sucks. You feel the same way they do. You want someone like you in parliament. That's why Donald Trump was so popular. He played politics like personality politics like crazy, and people ate it up because they hated the elite that the Democratic Party was so far behind in explaining. All of these are ways by which personality politics itself is popular as well. On the outside of the house, when we have similar candidates, people like Yanis Varoufakis who are able to play on these exact same anxieties and relate to people in the exact same visceral way, we get that buy-in on our side. Point.
Capitalism, this debate doesn't happen in America, where capitalism failing is like okay because you have like other institutions to depend on. It's helped countries like India, it's helped countries like Bangladesh, it's given employment to several people, and it's actually developed the nation.
So actually, like that's factually not true. Like most, like Bangladesh doesn't, like in most of the third world doesn't have that strong left-wing parties. Left-wing parties tend to be stronger in first world countries such as Europe, where they have historically had a base, in America as well. All of these are plausible as well. But we're talking about left-wing parties in Bangladesh and etc. We would point out that in the third world as well, capitalism has failed by generating mass inequalities. Globalization has hurt large amounts of people. There's massive ecological harm that means that rural farmers get killed. All of these are harms as well. What happens on our side of the house? On our side of the house, we simply win more seats. We flip more seats and get more power on our side. Massive wins for the left. But even if we don't, we will say that there's a secondary, even more important impact. That this is just the morally right thing to advocate for, given how toxic capitalism has become. Note that all of the analysis I gave earlier explains that even if we get fewer wins on our side of the house, in the fewer constituencies where we do win, we make a outsized, larger impact on the lives of working class people. We give them better lives at the point at which we give them tuition. We feed the hungry, clothe the sick. All of these are benefits we get. But even if you don't buy that, on principle, they have a moral obligation to do this. Because on some level, even if it's unpopular, speaking the truth is an obligation of political parties. We saw this in the past when anti-slavery movements were unpopular at first, but it's a moral obligation to speak out on behalf of those they purport to represent. On that side of the house, they continuously have to beat the dead horse as capitalism. On our side, we set people free from it.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite the leader of opposition.
Am I clearly audible and visible?
Yeah, I can hear and see you.
All right. Am I? Hello, can someone say something? I'm very unclear if I can hear everything.
Yeah, I can hear and see you.
All right, excellent. So PY is verbal. All right, so starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Trump actually lost the 2016 election by popular vote. He got into power because American politics have electoral systems, and that's kind of a bit fucked up, right? And more importantly, in 4 years, he lost to a senile old man by a margin of 100 million votes because the American people wanted anything except another 4 years of a fire-branded lunatic in the American presidency. That is precisely why our proposition will lose this debate. 2 things. First, I'm going to analyze why they literally will not get power on their side, and why they permanently screw over democratic politics on their side. And secondly, on assuming that they do get power, why they fundamentally pause in politics and why that's extraordinarily harmful. Before that, I want to clarify, first of all, exactly what these firebrand left-wing leaders look like. Because I don't think it's Bernie Sanders, right? Because the Infoslide clearly states you have to be particularly inflammatory, right? But crucially, Number one, you have to be intentionally inflammatory. Bernie Sanders is actually quite, mellow in comparison. Maybe he's inflammatory by accident because, he says things right fingers don't like, but he doesn't intentionally use rhetoric that incites people to be angry for him and against him as well, right? This is, for example, calling the other side who doesn't support climate change policies to be murderers, to be ravagers of the future generation, etc. You have to use this rhetoric. But the second characterization is more important. Notice that parties will generally have a singular individual whom they brand as the singular firebrand politician for their party. The reason you can't have a multiplicity of different firebrand politicians is twofold. One, it is easy to construct a single narrative behind which the entire party rallies behind. It is easier to characterize, let's say, I don't know, Shayor as one and his backstory as being one that makes him who he is, then, for example, having 5 other people. Secondarily, it prevents internal clash. It is difficult to run a party with like 5 different huge personalities within it. It is better to have a singular person representing the radical arm of the party overall. With that said, I want to firstly explain why these sort of left-wing individuals who try to achieve power on a platform of firebrand is oftentimes never going to get elected, right? A couple of structural reasons for this. The first thing to point out is that firebrand politics, even if they get people to vote for them, oftentimes get significantly more people to vote against them, right? For a couple of reasons. One, the majority of people don't like being called shitty human beings, right? The nature of firebrand politics is inherently polarizing. It has to demonize the people who doesn't subscribe in the ideology, right? Which means that people are going to be pissed off at being called bad human beings, and they're going to express that moral concern they have in the ballot. Secondarily, notice that the people that left-wing parties oftentimes tend to target tend to be majorities or establishment, right? Therefore, the number of people who mobilize against you are going to be a huge number of people. Insofar as attacking white people means that many white people in America are going to come out and vote against you in the presidential election or any other election, let's say state elections, right? But the second thing is that the narratives that are going to be weaponized against firebrand politicians are particularly persuasive. Because I want to remind the panel, who was the last example of a very radical, persuasive, enigmatic left-wing leader, it was Hitler. It was Stalin and Mussolini. Therefore, these past political examples are very easy weaponry that right-wing apparatus can use to essentially delegitimize your viewpoint by calling you the next Hitler, the next Stalin who's going to drown this country in communism and famine, right? In famine. But moreover, there's always going to be some people, staunch moderates within the party, who will oppose this, right? This happened during the GOP crisis, right? Where Mitch Romney literally threatened to break the GOP into fragmented moderate Republican Party, which literally means that the party overall becomes weaker because it's fragmented into different parts. You can't advocate over similar issues because the moderates, who oftentimes have a strictly moderate viewpoint, will never ever try to support this, even if the majority of the party does so, right? What is the impact of this? One, it means you oftentimes won't get elected in 2 ways. First of all, in primaries, like I want to just vibe check this, guys. Bernie Sanders didn't get elected by his own people. The Democrats decided not to vote him in because they don't like these radical policies. I'll take that later. But secondarily, you don't get into power in national elections, in state elections, and don't become senators, and therefore you have jack shit power. But secondarily, electability in the future is screwed over, right? Because the image of this radical politician is imprinted into the image of the party overall, right? If you see a crazy lunatic trying to advocate for democratic policies in the future, it will be fearful that the Democratic Party might platform these crazy ideas again and not vote for them preemptively, right? Before I weigh this, I'll take that point.
So actually, Joe Biden is currently the least popular American president of all time. Trump only lost because of his terrible COVID response. A coincidence, Trump is likely to win. On our side of the house, when we push the resource of the party behind Bernie Sanders, who vilified billionaires, not white people, that's a ridiculous claim, we can clearly get him to win and clearly win large amounts of elections.
Yeah, Trump got 75 million votes in America. Yes, I agree. He's popular. That does incite popular support. He got 175 million people to vote against him, right? So yes, you incite followers, but you incite way more counter followers who then jeopardize electability. What is the weighing here? All the impacts are contingent on solving the dying nature of capitalism, right? They're trying to solve the problem by ensuring left-wing politicians get platform. We have proven left-wing politicians won't get a platform on their side, which means our impact is logically prior to them, which means you automatically win the debate from the get-go. Let's say you buy none of that. Let's say in some magical hypothetical world, these firebrand left-wing politicians do get political office. Our second argument is going to be then on why in that particular scenario, and by the way, it's not a contradiction, and it's an even if, on why that poisons politics, right? A couple of broad structural problems here. The first thing is that this leads to significant polarization within politics. Why is this the case? The first thing to point out is that when the nature of politics becomes this particular political party calling all right-wingers to be the enemies of humanity, right? Because just because they don't like radical climate solution, right? This means it's very difficult for the two parties, conservative and liberals, to try to coalesce together and find common ground because they can't cooperate with their enemies. But secondarily, notice that the rise of left-wing firebrands is going to lead to a significant counter-response from the right-wing, who are in response going to platform right-wing firebrands. So it looks like many, many more attempts at creating more Trumps, more inflammatory versions of Trumps who are going to become the face of the Republican Party or any other conservative party in the world. Why is this bad? One, it just leads to more policy gridlocks, right? This is particularly problematic because note the Infoslide says that these politicians give particularly huge expectations, right? That is precisely what Trump lost power, because the capacity for you to create change is no different than any other politician, despite setting the expectations quite high. So when you don't meet that high expectation, you necessarily let people down, especially minorities who are already apathetic, will become even more apathetic on their side because the grand promises on which they went to the elections for the first time have been let down, right? But secondarily, you destroy social cohesion, right? You have brothers who can no longer talk to each other because one of them is Republican, the other one is Democratic or Democrat. So on a macro and micro level, polarization is really, really bad. But secondarily, politics becomes about personality, right? You don't care if this person has good policies, are going to make your life better. You just feel this person is a more holy, a more moral person on the other side, which leads you necessarily then to maybe vote in a worse politician who you perceive to be slightly more moral, which we think is really, really bad. For all these reasons, I'm extraordinarily proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now my deputy guidance.
You, it's not me, it's Cavan. Let's pass him the top.
Oh, sorry.
Clear the pens, please. Okay, your eyes in chair, please. The previous speaker relies on the word crazy lunatic a lot. But things like universal basic income, universal healthcare coverage, things like being against police brutality, being against gender discrimination, being against pulling apart families at the border, these are not crazy. We admit they are radical, but they are things that are acceptable and things that are desired right now. The reason why the entire speech is analytically behind everything Ian says is because they don't respond to the changing context in every democracy around the world right now, which is that people are becoming increasingly dissatisfied and disenchanted with the status quo. And what they want is radical change, and the period of centrism and the period of moderation is over. The comparative opposition needs to defend is the most moderate or most centrist candidate. And I just want to make a cursory observation here. They spend a lot of time attacking why is it the case that our firebrand politician would be so controversial and so polarizing, but very little analysis on why is it the case that a completely unassuming, inoffensive and forgettable candidate would be something that's persuasive to the people that are looking towards democracy for a solution. Why would a politician who's pushing for minimal change, minor change, incremental change, invisible changes, why would that ever be appealing? Why would that ever be inspirational for the people that are looking towards democracy as the solution to the woes in their life? Ian explains that a forgettable candidate will never be able to capture the hearts and the minds of the left for reasons that remain unresponded. Many voters are becoming disenchanted due to the failures of capitalism. They are leading increasingly painful lives where they struggle to pay rent, where they struggle to get a job, and they want a politician who can promise them that tomorrow will be better. But secondly, desiring change is inherent to the ideology of the left. These are progressive. They want societies to change. Demographically speaking, they are young people, university students with big aspirations for the future. If you are someone that identifies as left-leaning, a core part of leftist ideology is that you do not like the status quo and you envision a better world for humanity. This looks like African Americans who do not want minor changes to the police system, but they want the system of policing to be overhauled. This looks like environmentalists who don't want companies to just stop using plastic straws, but they want a fundamental implementation of environmental-friendly plastic policies. There are few observations here that will help weigh Ian's claim. The first,
This is a group of voters that are being lost now. They do not vote for centrist candidates who will preserve the status quo. They are becoming disenchanted with democracy. They feel like the system of democracy has failed them because it just keeps creating moderate candidates that do not change anything, where year after year, election cycle after election cycle, nothing changes because Joe Biden and Donald Trump are just both white men that push for the same kinds of policies. These are the people now that are not participating and not showing up in elections. Those are the people whose imaginations we capture and actually get them to go to the polls. This claim is analytically prior because the left wing must first secure a core group of followers before it can attempt to sway moderates. They got the priorities in reverse. They think that the main incentive of a political party is to capture the undecided people, to capture the moderates. But no, the first thing you must do is to get a core group of voters, those that are ideologically aligned with you. We explain firebrand politicians, therefore, are aligned with the desires of these specific groups of people. I will now, in weighing, explain why this group of people is large. Demographically speaking, the left draws its support from the youth. Older individuals statistically are more likely to have traditional and conservative values. The majority of your core followers on the left are aspirational people, and this is not an extreme subset of people. It is the majority of left-leaning individuals and people that vote Democrat. Second, this is particularly true in developing countries with booming youth populations that are entering university education and being exposed to ideas of change and being exposed to ideas of socialism. Those are the individuals that want big changes with regards to corruption, welfare, and government. If you are born in a developing country where you're exposed to corruption and you're exposed to the failures of capitalism, you do not want a centrist politician that is just proposing minor changes like a 1% increase in corporate tax. You want big changes and big overhauls to the system. Lastly, Ian explains the group of people that want big changes is getting larger and larger with each election cycle. More people face unemployment and are becoming exposed to the horrors of capitalism. More people are witnessing the genocides and war existing online and on social media. More people are feeling the existential anxiety of climate change. So, for every year that passes, our impacts snowball because every year more people want radical change. The problem with the opposition's attack is that they are uncomparative. They say fracturing will happen on our side of the house. This is symmetric. On their side, the centrist candidate will fracture the more ideologically charged candidates because those other ideologically charged candidates are upset with the centrist candidates as not making any change. But then they say, white people will feel attacked. Will those people who are white and feel attacked vote Democrat and vote left on their side of the house? They don't prove that delta either. The next thing they say is, even if you can get into party, you cannot, even if you get into politics and parliament, you cannot get any change because you overpromise. But we don't need to actually get the change. We just need to have a public fight to show that we're trying to get this end goal and we're trying to push this policy. Obviously, voters are not irrational. They will understand that we're trying to push this policy and there's certain difficulties in parliament like political gridlock that will prevent us from getting it. It doesn't mean that we are going back on our promise. It just means that we are in the process of fulfilling our promise. That is not a harm. So at this point in my speech, the only benefit that you can credit this opposition team for is alienating a small group of moderates that are increasingly desiring radical change. At this point in my speech, Ian and I explained that this appeals to left-wing voters and this group is electorally significant. This means on the first clash of winning an election, we are already winning because the likelihood is highest on our side. I will now explain why we win on everything else, but before that, POI.
AOC is a very rational, non-personality related candidate who does platform things like UBI and radical climate policy. The debate isn't about the nature of these issues, but rather the people who present them and the way they advocate for these.
Wait, AOC is a polarizing figure. She's an example for our side. She is a firebrand politician. Those things work for us. Okay, now I'll explain the other benefits that we get besides the higher likelihood of winning an election. Just having a consistent support base that shows up for elections lowers the margin between right-wing parties, which is an independently good outcome. It is inspirational to attract political talent. It encourages more people to vote because if the margin is small, individual voters feel like they might make a difference in the next election. Secondly, your core followers are the ones that volunteer for grassroots initiatives. They help with community outreach. They provide political donations. They show up for rallies. These voters are more important because they also contribute to political parties in other ways other than their vote. So they are a more important group that we must appeal to, not just moderates in general. At this point, even if you don't believe we sweep the elections, you will believe the two other independent benefits that help sustain the party in the long term, being able to attract talent with a core supporter base and being able to get donations and volunteering because of the core support base. I will now explain why we win on the metric of moral obligation. The left-wing party differs from right-wing parties because they also care about what is principally right. The left represents the oppressed and the marginalized. If you are an oppressed woman or oppressed member of the LGBTQ community, you do not want someone who is just promising small and minor changes. You want someone that's promising promising to overhaul the systems of discrimination. Fulfilling this moral obligation has a practical outcome as well. It is not just meeting your principal basis of being a left political party, but also encourages the overturn window effect. Pushing for major changes in parliament is what forces conservative parties to moderate in an attempt to capture moderates that are now being lost. At the end of the day, the question you need to ask yourself is, based on the current state of politics and the desires of voters, what is the correct strategies that the left-wing party ought to take?
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now thank the deputy leader for the conversation.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
I think the reality of the status quo, if you look at the actions of firebrand politicians like Trump, Modi, and Erdogan, is that dictatorial figures don't give a fuck about your politics. These are generally self-interested people who polarize politics, consolidate their powers, and empirically stroke up nationalistic fevers to strike wars. Perhaps Prime Minister is correct in his diagnostics, the status quo is bad. But what we will prove to you is that their policy makes the status quo far worse, and we think that's good enough reason as to why this motion shouldn't pass. But before that, I think Prop 2 tries to squirrel out of this motion, because I don't think this debate is about having radical ideologies, because those ideologies exist in the status quo anyways. So for example, people like Bernie Sanders already run on many of the things that they want to do, but to a larger degree, people like Biden also echoed these policies as well, someone who they decidedly agree is not radical, to the extent to which Biden also believes in giving bailouts for federal loans, for example. The debate, or the majority of it, must happen in the ways in which you pitch these ideologies in the first place. What does this mean? It often means radical statements, like polarizing statements or ad hominem attacks. It often means you gain more power in politics as you become these firebrand politicians, like people like Trump do, like people like Erdogan do in the first place. There are two cases that I want to analyze. The first is, and I want to be very, very charitable here, are the instances in which these politicians actually do succeed. And second, I want to analyze the instances in which whether they can succeed. So let's take Prop in their best. And I will assume that these politicians are going to succeed, that they are so charismatic that people are going to be, bought into their charisma, and then everything is going to go swimmingly there. There are 4 reasons why the situation is then going to get much, much worse. The first is they really can't do huge change because the capacity to do change is largely symmetric on both sides of the aisle, to the extent to which there's a political gridlock and constraints in capital, but the promises that you give under their side is much larger. They say that, voters are going to be rational, but you stop this rationality to the extent to which you are very, very charismatic and very polarizing because you overpromise them things, and these people tend to believe in that to the extent to which Trump can get away by saying things like you should drink chloroform, and many people actually end up drinking chloroform. So why is it that they can't have these massive reforms that they want under their side? The first is just very simple capital restraints. Like, sure, everyone wants universal healthcare. Who the fuck is going to pay for it? We'll make the rich pay for it. They can simply leave the country, and there's numerous legal loopholes. But even if you could, how are you going to get that through Congress, right? Maybe the president is someone who's very communist, but how do you ensure that you have enough seats in Congress to make sure that you actually pass those bills? Realistically, then, the large amount of change that they want under their side simply don't occur at a point at which voters have been promised these large radical changes. To that extent, then, I think voters are likely going to feel that the left has betrayed them, and to that extent, they're going to go against the left because they think they're full of shit. They don't deliver on the things that they actually want. Let's say this is not true. You get your radical change happening. Secondly, what we tell you that even then, politics becomes even worse because it becomes increasingly about personality. Robiah explains why there's a necessary singularity associated with these firebrand politicians. We explain to you why there's an importance of a singular narrative, but even beyond that, because these people have a cult of personality, they will want as many people to subscribe to that cult of personality, and it doesn't make sense to have another rivaling cult of personality within your same political club, because that just means it gets fractured. To that extent, then, these individuals become widely popular, and people end up voting on them simply because they are so charismatic. And note, proposition must concede to this, because otherwise none of their benefits end up materializing. And we see a lot of examples of this happening in the status quo anyways. People like Trump, people like Modi. But the problem is, these are individuals who can then do horrible, horrible things and still get away with it, specifically because they are so popular. Look to examples of Viktor Orban, for example, in the Hungary, who disbanded the Supreme Court, or they fired one person from the Supreme Court. Look to places like Turkey, where Erdogan got rid of term limits. Even look to America, where Donald Trump got rid of, did the January 7th thing, and is still largely president, or is in contention of being president. They have the incentive to run for power or to consolidate power, to the extent to which, if you are someone who's firebrand, you're probably very power hungry. But even beyond that, I think politicians generally tend to be power hungry because they ran for office in the first place. But they have that city now. One, because the people in the country are bought in by their charisma. But two, no one else in your party is going to go against you because they're afraid of tipping party lines and are afraid of being voted as sideliners and are going out of that party. All of this proves is that even if your left-wing ideologies would become sidelined at a point at which these politicians become the primary face, we prove why that's uniquely harmful. Third, we think that politics gets far more polarized at a point at which you specifically have politicians that say that politician is not only bad, they are evil, they are against the values of our country. To that extent, I think Robiah analyzes why people no longer feel comfortable living in that country. They feel as though they can't talk to their own brothers who believe in different political systems. You can't have a conversation with other people. If this happens on a macro scale, the country becomes extremely polarized. People are far less happy in that country. Lastly, these are individuals who tend to be extremely nationalistic, because if you want to rile up your voter base, the easiest way to do so is to often stroke nationalistic figures, hence why most firebrand politicians tend to do so. And note, there's no inherent contradiction between nationalism and left-wing ideologies. You can believe in Marxism, but also believe that, I don't know, Bengalis are the true people of God or whatever. To that extent, then, I think that this largely means that wars are far more likely to happen, especially in promiscuous areas of the world like South America or in Africa, for example. I think national conflict is likely to happen on a much larger scale. But before I go on to explain why you don't actually win, I'll take the POI.
So this is a ridiculous push for the very simple reason that nationalism, consolidation of power at all costs are features of the right wing. If your core base literally is based on egalitarianism and accountability, they will never support you. Your political allies will never support you in that scenario.
That is a very, very narrow interpretation of what left-wing ideologies look like. You can believe in climate change, you can believe in Marxism, but you can also believe that power ought to be consolidated in one hand. Because guess what? The Soviet Union was a fucking dictatorial state. Cuba was a fucking dictatorial state. Hitler was the head of the National fucking Socialist Party. You need to be more charitable. Let's talk about your prospects of winning. And their primary push here is that capitalism is failing, and then most people tend to be raging communists who are now going to vote for you. 3 observations. First, people may agree there is a problem in the economy, but they disagree on what the solutions are, because many people genuinely end up believing that capitalism is the solution. This is why when Trump ran for elections, most of the people who voted for him weren't rich corporations, because then he wouldn't win. They were Rust Belt workers who worked blue income jobs because they felt that the liberal elites had failed them, and through embracing capitalism, they can then win. Secondly, I think generally, if you look at the demographics of America, moderates are the most important, because old people are middle-aged individuals are demographically the majority. These are also individuals who have the most amount of money. So to the extent to which you need campaign finances, that is the most important thing. But third, there are just genuine reasons to believe that capitalism actually works. Look at all the technological developments that have happened over the past 20 years or so. Look at the economic benefits that have come to most of the developing countries, all of which can lead people to believing that capitalism actually works. At the end of this debate, then, they needed to prove to us why left-wing ideologies are important, why they win. And even if they win, these politicians are going to save our democracies or whatever. We proved to you that even in their best case scenarios, we end up much worse. For all those reasons, let the motion fall.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now invite the government with.
Hi, can I be seen and heard clearly?
Yep.
All right, thank you. POIs through chat, please. The problem with the left and status quo is that they are increasingly associated with the establishment. Joe Biden is the least popular president in the history of American politics. In the global south, a wave of right-wing politicians have captured majorities using firebrand personalities by antagonizing the left as the unrelatable establishment who sits on ivory towers and cannot bring solutions to problems of unhappy voters. You have Mahathir in Malaysia, Marcos in the Philippines, Modi in India, and let me be clear, Hitler was right-wing, not left-wing, and so side negative is simply not debating reality. Their sudden extension from deputy is this idea that the left-wing firebrand politicians will become dictators and start wars because nationalism is going to be their strategy. This is just factually untrue. Ian already points out in a POI that leftist voters won't find dictatorship an appealing platform. Obviously, they're not going to vote for individuals they likely think will escalate into these kinds of politics, especially when your platforms are all about egalitarianism and redistributing property and helping the poor. It's very difficult for you to reach this outcome of dictatorship from these very initial premises that would require a lot of logical steps to reach that very problematic outcome that opposition wants. So but let me be incredibly charitable here. Here are two more responses. One, we think that this misses the problem of status quo. The problem in status quo right now isn't that the biggest problem is these firebrand politicians will become incredibly problematic. The problem is that it's already problematic among the right. The goal of this debate then is to counter the already incredibly powerful focus of the right on these populist platforms and using firebrand politics to their favor. That is the goal of this debate. So opposition is not answering that burden push. The second response I have here is to say that even if all of this is true, all of these harmful impacts are behind our analysis, which is just more important given the material you hear from Cavan and Ian. And that is the left has an obligation to platforming minority politics, of platforming the rights of oppressed individuals, of platforming progressive politics that the right will never ever do. And it's essential that you utilize a narrative that's able to actually do justice to these issues, because if the left doesn't do it, no one will. What is the main push you hear from side negative in terms of attacking our case? Side negative says that firebrand politicians are not palatable to the vast majority of people. I want to highlight that this ignores two big contributions that already came from side affirmative. The first contribution it ignores is the idea that firebrand personalities are a tried and tested effective strategy as already demonstrated by the right. We tell you in terms of premise that voters are already unhappy in status quo. Ian gives you structural reasons for why this personality of firebrand politics resonates with voters who are already disenchanted with status quo illusions. So even if what deputy says is true, because their side says that, capitalism has helped lift a lot of people out of poverty, yes, but people also cannot afford basic necessities in this capitalistic world. People feel unhappy, even though in terms of numbers, the world is getting better. People on the ground don't feel happy with the fact that maybe immigrants are stealing our jobs, etc., etc. Why is this important? This is important because the problem in status quo right now, that again, side negative does not engage with, is that the right is able to capture these unhappy voters, because if the left doesn't do it, the right will. So this is the burden that they refuse to engage with, because elections are zero sum. If the left does not capture these voters will go to the right and they will vote for policies that advocate for immigrants being kicked out and deported, advocate for policies that continue to disenfranchise vulnerable people and minorities, who allow for the scapegoating of religious minorities and people in already incredibly divided societies. So the problem with opposition then is that they're unable to prove how exactly they're able to engage with a realistic concept, like the realistic case of the majority of democracies in the world. What is the second contribution from affirmative that side opposition completely ignores? The second contribution from our side that they ignore is this idea that firebrand personalities are just inherently persuasive. Again, the way that the right currently demonizes the left in status quo is that the left is the establishment. They're bland, they're boring, they're irrelevant, they are not actually solving your problems as citizens. For example, in Singapore, the center-left opposition party is viewed as a merely less effective version of the center-right ruling party. So efficacy in solving problems that people care about is actually a pretty good political platform. And the only way you can actually do that effectively is if you reinvent yourself as a firebrand, because that's how you're able to tell the people in relatable language, we are here to solve your problems. How does side affirmative solve this? Ian explains to you that voters vote based on feelings. Even if the economy and the statistics and the numbers say the world is getting better, if voters on the ground are starving and they don't feel these effects, they will not feel these effects at all, and that will translate into elections. They do not understand the intricacies of politics. They need emotions and relatable language that we already explained to you is unique to the firebrand strategy. We tell you coming from first and second. This is the way in which we're able to win. What is the conclusion here? The conclusion is that you need firebrand firebrand personalities to rally radical policies like relaxing immigration to allow people in and universal basic income, because voters do not identify with policies that uplift the lives of millions of people, even if it's objectively good. What they identify with is the person who presents these kinds of policies to them. So people like Sleepy Joe or leftist candidates who are branded as elitist or are associated with the establishment because the right villainizes them in this way are not going to capture voters, and therefore there's an urgency to rebrand in a radical way, which you only get through firebrand personalities. That's how we solve this problem on our side of the house. The absence of a solution and negative already loses them this debate in terms of prior analytical rigor. Point.
Biden got into power by running on a platform of unification. If both Democrats and Republicans are both firebrand, how do you guarantee the Democrat amount of firebrand is going to win elections while the Republicans are going to lose?
Yeah, not listening. We explain to you. One, they're able to make sure that the right can no longer use this as an effective strategy because the leftists are also doing it. Two, you equalize the playing ground because we are also able to prove to people that we are able to solve these problems and are a viable political option. So again, this already came from Ian and set up, not listening. Moving on then, why should the left do this? The second major contribution you hear from our side of the house is that the left has an ideological obligation to these individuals. We tell you two main things. One, you need to get the loyalty of people who care about the oppressed and marginalized. You need to be seen as an option viable for change. This is what Cavan tells you. These are the people who are most likely to support your party, who are going to donate, campaign, and vote, who care about the issues you platform, and you're only able to tell them this effectively if you are a firebrand. This is the nuance of the left wing. Your ideology is about creating progressive policies of changing status quo because there are problems in status quo right now, just not giving ample rights to minorities or things, or just demographic of voters who tend to be younger individuals, students, educated individuals who recognize that there's change that is needed in status quo. And this is consistent only with the firebrand personality because that's the only strategy that meets the burden of challenging the problems of status quo in a way that's effective enough to counter the right, which is already trying to do this right now. The second thing we tell you under the second major contribution is that the left wing has a duty to do this strategy. This is important because if the left doesn't do it, who's going to preach about the problems of minority struggles in mainstream politics? Obviously, the right is not going to do this. And we tell you that the benefits isn't even winning the elections. It's about having a platform to advocate for these policies. So even if you win only one constituency, in this constituency, you can have at least local policies and regulation that allow for more relaxed rights for minorities, or you're able to have a home ground for expanding your policy provisions or expanding your campaign as the left. And we tell you that inherently being able to advocate for this is already important and meaningful precisely because the right isn't going to do it, and you need to counter their power. For these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite the opposition.
Hi, right. POS via chat's fine. Preferences okay. Good. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to note that firebrand politicians are not radical politicians. There's a massive difference, right? Radical politicians can have radical policies. That's very different than firebrand politicians. It's a brand, it's a character, it's a personality that they show that makes them firebrand. So Trump could have the same policies and he'd be named a radical president, but the fact that he was as crazy and as lunatic as he was is the reason why he's called a firebrand politician, right? It's completely different. Second thing is, I think the biggest assumption that Prop has is that they assume that the left wing will work. They assume that, okay, if the left wing does come to power, all of this fixes itself. We tell you that there are a lot of issues when it comes to polarization, especially when firebrand politicians are involved. But we'll also prove to you that the left wing isn't guaranteed to work, and that in and of itself is a premise that loses them this debate. Thirdly, their entire point on obligation, I think, is quite dumb. So I'll take it down before I move forward with the clashes, right? Firstly, again, radical politicians still exist. So even if you have an obligation to minorities, if you have an obligation to people that you want to care for within the left wing political spectrum, you can still do that without being a firebrand politician, and that does happen, right? The same way that AOC is more radical than Biden means that AOC would care for more climate change policies than Biden would, which means in the same party, you can have politicians that work for different people and make sure you gain those advantages that they want to claim. Secondly, they keep talking about minorities that the left wing needs to care about, but there are also right-wing minorities that the left wing completely ignores. So regardless of what happens, it's pretty symmetric. Minorities on either side are fucked simply because they're like, both sides have an obligation to be radical and to be firebrand. But the point in time in which only one is, and if both are, you're unable to help both at the same time. Thirdly, I'll just weigh this off. Even if we lose the obligation point, what's more important? Winning the election is, because only at that point would you be able to exercise your policy as a left-wing party to make sure certain things exist. And that is the entire claim we've had, that you are unlikely to win the election on their side, you're unlikely to gain power on their side when you're firebrand. The last thing, the POI that Robiah gave to their whip, the answer was pretty bad, right? Oh, you have a level playing field, so you might win, you might lose, right? It guarantees nothing. I'll rather flip it. The reason why Clinton won the popular vote against someone like Trump, even though those emails leaked like what, weeks before her election, means that people were afraid of Trump. People felt isolated when Trump was there. People were threatened by Trump's comments because people are rational when it comes to deciding. I can see your POI, I'll take it, don't worry. So people were like scared of what Trump wanted, right? And what he meant for, what he stood for. And that is why they wanted someone more rational. Unfortunately, that never worked out. Or maybe fortunate, who knows? Getting to my clash, I have one big thing that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the fractures in the political system, right? 3 things over here. Firstly, their big claim is that people want radical change, and that is because a lot of these left-wing people are like young and progressive. Okay, but Shayor mentions this, right? Young people are like probably more like young voters are more apathetic towards political issues, which means that they create like they have a low like a shorter like a lower turnout in like voting polls or like elections, but more importantly, they just don't matter as much when it comes to like moderates, like 40, 50-year-old uncles who like drink beer and watch football on Sunday or Saturday or whatever Americans do, right? So that's the thing, that you don't like, if you want to win elections, if you want to gain power, that is not the demographic that you want to highlight or target. But secondly, people are still afraid of polarizing rhetoric. So this means that, sure, while young and progressive people want radical change, and there is an obligation for you to make sure that you're radical by being firebrand, again, two very distinct things, right? You will still feel attacked, even as a young person, because if you don't contribute to the climate as much as this firebrand politician is telling you to, you will feel like, okay, this might be getting too much. This might be scary. I might not want to be as supportive as I was before, right? And obviously for opposition, it's even worse, right? For the opposition party and people who support it. Secondly, political parties don't need moderates. They want a strong group of people. That's their claim. I disagree with this. You want power, you want to win an election. That is why majority of the presidents, if not all of the presidents in the United States, have not been completely radical and lunatic, including Trump himself. Why is this true? Because without moderates, you are able to mobilize support against firebrand leaders, like Robiah has mentioned, because again, they're threatening, they're scary, their rhetoric is often weird and alien. But secondly, you liken these leaders to bad figures, especially because the right wing has a big agenda against the left wing. They're able to like liken them to Hitler, Mussolini, and Hitler was like a fascist. So it doesn't matter if he was right or left. I think he had more left alignments because he was communist as well. But in a lot of these essences, you're just able to make sure that these people are like, you call them bad things, you have smear campaigns, you just run bad things like the right wing often does. But lastly, the threshold for support for right wing policies is just lower than left wing policies, because left wing is progressive, right wing is current, it's conservative, which often means that when you're more firebrand, not only is that threshold, not only does that threshold already exist, which often causes a problem for left wing politicians in general, the point in time in which you're firebrand often isolates that threshold to a larger degree and makes sure that you aren't able to communicate with the voters to the best degree. With this entire, and the fact that they've disproven their entire point of you losing the election, we already win this debate. But lastly, they tell us that fragment is symmetric. I disagree, right? Because again, we want to win the election, and that is why left-wing parties often have people like Obama, they have people like Biden, they have people like Elizabeth Warren. These are people who are more centrist and people who do get the votes. There is a reason why Bernie Sanders didn't get out of the primary, right? While he's a great guy and we all love him and he makes great memes, he's often scary as a leader because we don't know what he's thinking. But secondly, a lot of these times, these parties are scared of these firebrand leaders. Same with Mitt Romney was, same with John McCain was, because the cult of personality that they build is often hurtful and harmful to the brand image that these politicians have and these parties have, which often makes it a risk to make sure that they're leading in that specific position, right? Before I move forward, I'll take that POI.
Yeah, our case is analytically prior because firebrand politics is necessary to sell voters radical policies in the first place. How do you sell these policies on your side if you have to counter the right?
Radical policies exist on our side as well, right? Like, but the problem is that radical policies becoming popular is a difficult branch anyways. The point in which you bring firebrand leaders does not help it, simply because firebrand leaders are threatening. That is the difference. Okay, let's say that you win the election as a firebrand leader. Why is that still bad? Firstly, because we tell you that polarization is likely. I won't repeat the reasons, but why this is like consequentially bad? Because firstly, we tell you that at that point, power politics becomes more important than policy making. So both parties of the right wing and the left wing will keep fighting with their firebrand leaders. But secondly, you incentivize the right wing to become even more firebrand. You will invite more Trumps to combat the left wing firebrand politicians that exist. It just becomes a nature. It just becomes like a problematic society over there, right? But secondly, the cult of personality that you have, again, the premise was built on the fact that left-wing, right, like firebrand leaders are good. But not true. There are failed socialist states, like we've seen in Venezuela, like we've seen in Honduras. There were radical changes that led to horrible societies because people were not in favor of them. People did not like them. And there was democratic backsliding in a lot of these places. The conclusion is simple. People and voters are affected most. They either become apathetic because they're scared, and because the threshold of the change that Shayor has mentioned is not fulfilled, people are often have less trust in the system. For all these reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite the opposition to reply.
Hello, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
Perfect. The reason why proposition loses this debate is because of how heavily unnuanced they are. Their entire take is that right-wing, evil, left-wing, really good people who are the glorious defenders of minorities and justice. When in reality, we tell you from Aadit that there are minorities who support conservatives. Look at the Cumans in Florida, for example, who have historically voted Republican. Look at the Rust Belt workers who, sure, aren't minorities because I guess they're white, but they're also heavily disenfranchised people to the extent to which these are poor. These are individuals who feel that they are more heavily represented by right-wing values and they genuinely believe in conservative ideologies. To the extent this is true, I have no idea why a priori left-wing values are necessarily good, especially since when you look at the history of predominantly left-wing countries like Ecuador, Venezuela, and Cuba, these are generally countries that are extremely corrupt and have failed under communism, and there's genuinely a lot of progress that has been made under capitalism that people have seen. But let's say you don't buy this. Our premise that even if we take them at their best is that it is better to live under a failing system of capitalism than it is to live under a dictator. I spent like 5 minutes of my speech explaining this, to which the government replies, there is no way that the left wing, which is so just, can possibly be so bad. For a moment, ignore Cuba, Venezuela, Cambodia, and the USSR, and just think in terms of incentives. The problem is, all politicians are inherently a lot of like self-interested to the extent to which you are probably have a drive for power, i.e. why you run. Therefore, you're probably like self-interested. And secondly, firebrand politicians are especially self-interested because you're the type of person who wants to really consolidate power and you have a like cult of personalities. The personalities of these individuals are likely those who are somewhat power hungry. To the extent that this is true, they have the capacity now to consolidate as much power as they want. One, because their own party is too scared to question them because they become the centralizing figure of their party and others are too afraid to question them. But two, because you have a cult of personality, then people are no longer going to vote on you based on policies, but based on your own personalities. So it becomes very easy for you to consolidate power. So even if you care about left-wing ideologies, those ultimately die down because ultimately there's a large degree of democratic backsliding, which is ultimately winning us this debate for 4 reasons. One, these countries tend to be extremely corrupt because no one's holding you accountable. But 2, your politics don't actually matter. So the left-wing policies that you care about don't really matter. But I think 3, to the extent to which democracy is like principally valuable because you care about autonomy. Therefore, I think we prove that democracy is worse off. Our principle then must be logically prior to theirs because their principle only works insofar as democracy works. But I think 4th, I proved to you in my speech why these are likely individuals who are going to strike nationalistic freeverse and why that leads to a lot of harmful impact for minorities as well as geopolitical tensions. Again, no response whatsoever. Their next contention then is that, guess what? The right wing already does this. Therefore, there's a need for the left wing to do this as well. I like just 2 things. One, this isn't a response, it's just a flaw in their logic. Just because there's a fire going on right now doesn't mean you need to fucking throw gas on it and make it bigger and make it a wildfire. I think inherently, if our democracy backslides, everyone is worse off. But 2, and this is something that Aadit points out, currently, if you are someone who's sick of Trump, you have the option of voting for the liberals because you don't view them as bad. Now, both of them are equally bad. So inherently, the situation gets far worse because you don't have an opt-out. And just to like vibe check this, look to the amount of firebrand politicians in different countries and how how those countries have backed it over the years, our characterization is the most realistic. But I think what we prove to you beyond that is that their model doesn't even work preliminarily because you don't end up winning these elections. We prove to you first that these politicians are someone who are inherently problematic and therefore turn into a lot of internal frictions within their country, within their own party, because they think that their party doesn't really represent them. Their response to this is that, moderates don't really matter because the vast majority of people aren't moderates. Like, empirically, this doesn't really make sense. One, because I think generally speaking, most people they tend to believe that capitalism works because they keep voting for capitalistic leaders, i.e. Trump can still win. But two, I think years of propaganda since the Cold War that tends to make you believe that communism doesn't work has taken a lot of effect. But I think just vibe check this. How many people genuinely believe in communism? And if these people are the majority, there is no need for this debate to happen because every single time those communists would win anyways. Therefore, this clearly can't happen. At the end of this debate, then, we are the only side that maintains our democracy. We are the only side that ensures that people don't kill themselves in a fever of polarization and nationalism. For those reasons, let the motion fall.
I have that speak the speech and I might the government.
This team is running away from the motion. Their stance at the end of 4 speeches is that we are not against radical ideology, we are not against radical policies, we are just against presentation. Although the info slide quite explicitly says that firebrand politicians incite great change, which would mean radical policies. They have made this debate absurd because at the end of their case, what they are disagreeing with us about is about the tone. If you look at their case, right, they say they're okay with the ideology, they just don't like the presentation. So the disagreement that they have is that they don't like that these firebrand politicians are rude and aggressive, to reduce the tone in which these politicians speak. And clearly they shot themselves in the foot here, because if it was just about the difference in presentation, why would this firebrand politician be a dictator? If it was just a difference in presentation, like this firebrand politician was more aggressive and rude, why would it lead to massive fracturing that tears apart the Democrat Party? Clearly, it is better for them to believe that it was about radical policies because that would have worked better for their case. So if they could reverse time, they shouldn't have taken that stance. This debate was one where they were incredibly uncharitable. We had to defend polarizing figures, passionate politicians that push for radical policy changes. They had to listen to us. We weren't pushing for communism. We were just pushing for things like universal basic income, pushing for things like higher corporate tax, pushing for things like improved like healthcare and welfare. This debate was not about pushing a politician that attacked white people or pushing a crazy lunatic. They gave you zero reason to believe why the firebrand politician was literally going to be Viktor Orban or Hitler or Donald Trump. Like, just look at how much this team relies on hyperbole, where their only examples of firebrand politicians would be literal dictators. But the motion doesn't say dictators, it says firebrand politicians. So clearly there is a distinction. And this is why the opposition team lost in prep, because they didn't want to defend the burden of a centrist politician that pushed for minor changes. They wanted to defend a fictional politician that was moderate in communication but somehow like radical in ideology, and they never actually wanted to engage with any portion of the reality of today's debate, which is that we get to defend firebrand politicians, not strongman politicians. For the sake of the debate, I will now explain why even under their wrong interpretation of the motion, we still win. First question, will people be upset at aggressive politicians? Ian explains in general, people are inspired by charismatic and passionate people. Naomi and I explain that for discriminated and oppressed individuals, a firebrand politician being aggressive represents their frustrations at the system. Naomi explains that the emotions that you use when you are being passionate means that you give people the vocabulary to express how you feel about the frustrations of the system, which is what inspires voters to show up to the polls. So even if they wanted to make this debate just about the tone in which politicians spoke when they're in parliament or when they're campaigning, we also won that clash on a massive margin because we told you that speaking passionately, yes, speaking rudely, and being a polarizing figure is what was attractive and has historically proven to be attractive. At best, what they prove is that being rude alienates white people, but this was never the comparative because those white people that felt attacked by rude and aggressive politicians were never a demographic that they could get to vote Democrat on their side of the house. Then they said, the firebrand politicians, they'll become a dictator and centralize power. This is the best part of their case. Okay, you can spend 5 minutes making an argument about how this firebrand politician will be a dictator, but it works against your case. Somehow, this firebrand politician can become a dictator and centralize power and stack the Supreme Court. but doesn't have enough power to pass environmental policies. So if you are admitting that the firebrand politician can centralize power, surely you are admitting there's a capacity for the firebrand politician to be able to implement some form of policy change. But the second kicker here is that you claim that all of their ideologies are the same. There's no difference in ideology. So why would a firebrand politician have a dictatorial ideology, but the other politicians won't? So if their ideology is all the same as per what you keep claiming, then surely this means that he wouldn't have the ideology of Fidel Castro in Cuba. I want to make the government win extremely clear. This team has no comparative. Ian and I painfully explain why centrist policies are not what people want now. Naomi explains why right-wing politicians will use firebrand tactics to capture the disenchanted. So even if you don't believe we win the election, you have even less reason to believe that this team comes anywhere close to winning any form of margin. And we didn't need to win the election to win this debate because we had 3 independent benefits. Things like attracting political talent, things like encouraging donations and volunteering, things like fulfilling a moral obligation. They only wanted to engage with us on the likelihood of winning the election and not the massive changes to political discourse that flowed from
I thank the speaker for their speech and all speakers for the debate. Yeah, there will be an OA, so if everyone could leave this breakout room and leave the judges to deliberate, it would be great.